In the first part, we have seen how Gregor's body was changed. It was metamorphosized, and he didn't know what was happening to him. He was in pain, in chaos, and unable to face his family. So now let's move on to the second part. So then he tried to get to the top part of his body out of his bed first, carefully turning his head to the side. This he managed quite easily, and despite its breadth and its weight, the bulk of his body eventually followed slowly in the direction of the head. But when he had at last got his head out of the bed and into the fresh air, it occurred to him that if he let himself fall, it would be a miracle if his head were not injured. So he became afraid to carry on pushing himself forward the same way. And he could not knock himself out now at any price. Better to stay in bed than lose consciousness. And it took just as much as effort to get back to where he had been earlier. But when he lay there shying and was once more watching his legs as they struggled against each other even harder than before, if that was possible, he could think of no way of bringing peace and order to this chaos. He told himself once more that it was not possible for him to stay in bed, and that the most sensible thing to do would be to get free of it in whatever may be good and whatever sacrifice. At the same time, though, he did not forget to remind himself that calm consideration was much better than rushing to desperate conclusions. At times like this, he would direct his eyes to the window and look out as clearly as he could. But unfortunately, even the other side of the narrow street was enveloped in morning fog, and the view had little confidence or cheer to offer him. 7 o'clock already, he said to himself when the clock struck again. 7 o'clock, and there's still a fog like this. And he lay there quietly a while longer, breathing lightly, as if he perhaps expected the total stillness to bring things back to their real and natural state. But then he said to himself, before it strikes 7:15, I'll definitely have to have got out of the bed properly. And by then somebody will have come around from work to ask what's happened to me as well, as they open up at work before 7 o'clock. And so he set himself to task of swinging the entire length of his body out of the bed all at the same time. If he succeeded in falling out of the bed in this way and kept his head raised as he did so, he could probably avoid injuring it. His back seemed to be quite hard, and probably nothing would happen to it in falling onto the carpet. His main concern was for the loud noise he was bound to make, and which even through all the doors would probably raise concern if not alarm. But it was something that had to be risked. When Gregor was already sticking halfway out of the bed, the new method was more of a game than an effort. All he had to do was rock back and forth. It occurred to him how simple everything would be if somebody could help him. Two strong people he had in his mind, his father and the maid, would have been more than enough. They would only have to push their arms under the dome of his back, peel him away from the bed, bend down with the load, and then be patient and careful as he swung over onto the floor, where hopefully the little legs would find a use. Should he really call for help, even apart from the fact that all the doors were locked? Despite all the difficulty he was in, he could not suppress a smile at this thought. After a while, he had already moved so far across that it would have been hard for him to keep his balance if he rocked too hard. The time was now 7:10, and he would have to make a final decision very soon. Then there was a ring at the door of the flat. That all be someone from work, he said to himself, and froze very still, although his little legs only became all the more lively as they danced around. For a moment everything remained quiet. They're not opening the door, Gregor said to himself, caught in some nonsensical hope. But then, of course, the maid's firm steps went to the door as ever and opened it. Gregor only needed to hear the visitor's first words of greeting, and he knew who it was. It was the chief clerk himself. Why did Grogger have to be the only one condemned to work for a company where they immediately became highly suspicious at the slightest shortcomings? Where all the employees, every one of them, was there not one of them who was faithful and devoted, who would go so mad with the pangs of conscience that he couldn't get out of the bed if he didn't spend at least a couple of hours in the morning on the company business? Was it really not enough to let one of the trainees make inquiries? Assuming inquiries were even necessary. Did the chief clerk have to come himself, and did they have to show the whole innocent family that this was so suspicious that only the chief clerk would be trusted to have the wisdom to investigate it? And more because these thoughts had made him upset than through any proper decision. He swung himself with all the force out of the bed. There was a loud thump, but it wasn't really a loud noise. His fall was softened a little by the carpet, and Grogger's back was also more elastic than he had thought, which made the sound muffled and not too noticeable. He had not held his head carefully enough, though, and hit it as he fell. Annoyed and in pain, he turned it and rubbed it against the carpet. "Something's fallen down in there," said the chief clerk in the room on the left. Grogger tried to imagine whether something of sort that had happened to him today could ever happen to the chief clerk too. You had to concede that it was possible, but as if in gruff reply to the question, the chief clerk's firm footsteps in his highly polished boots could now be heard in the adjoining room. From the room on the right, Grogger's sister whispered to him to let him know. "Grogger, the chief clerk is here." "Yes, I know," said the Grogger to himself, but without daring to raise his voice loud enough for his sister to hear him. "Grogger," said his father now from the room to his left, "the chief clerk has come around and wants to know why you didn't leave on the early train. We don't know what to say to him, and anyway, he wants to speak to you personally, so please open this door. I'm sure he will be good enough to forgive the untidiness of your room." Then the chief clerk called, "Good morning, Mr. Samsa." "He isn't well," said his mother to the chief clerk, while his father continued to speak through the door. "He isn't well, please believe me. Why else would Grogger have missed a train? The lad only ever thinks about the business. It nearly makes me cross the way. He never goes out in the evenings. He's been in town for a week now, but stayed home early evening. He sits with us in the kitchen and just reads the paper or studies train timetables. But anyways, I'm glad you are here. We wouldn't have been able to get Grogger to open the door by ourselves. He's so stubborn, and I'm sure he isn't well. He said this morning that he is, but he isn't." "I'll be there in a moment," said Grogger slowly and thoughtfully, but without moving so that he would not miss any word of the conversation. "Well, I can't think of any other way of explaining it, Mrs. Samsa," said the chief clerk. "I hope it's nothing serious, but on the other hand, I must say that if we people in commerce over become slightly unwell, then fortunately or unfortunately, as you like, we simply have to overcome it because of business considerations. Can the chief clerk come to see you now then?" asked his father impatiently, knocking at the door again. "No," said the Grogger. In the room on his right there followed a painful silence. In the room on his left his sister began to cry. So why did his sister not go and join the others? She had probably only just got up and had not even begun to get dressed. And why was she crying? Was it because he had not got up and had not let the chief clerk in? Because he was in danger of losing his job, and if that happened, his boss would once more pursue their parents with the same demands as before? There was no need to worry about things like that yet. Grogger was still there and had not the slightest intention of abandoning his family. For the time being, he just lay there on the carpet, and no one who knew the condition he was in would seriously have expected him to let the chief clerk in. It was only a minor discourtesy, and a suitable excuse would easily be found for it later on. It was not something for which Gregor would be sacked on the spot. And it seemed to Gregor much more sensible to leave him now in peace instead of disturbing him with talking and crying. But the others didn't know what was happening. They were worried that would excuse their behavior. The chief clerk now raised his voice. "Mr. Samsa," he called to him. "What is wrong? You barricade yourself in your room, give us no more explanation than just yes or no. You are causing serious and unnecessary concern to your parents and you fail. And I mentioned this just by the way. You fail to carry out your business duties in a way that is quite unheard of. I'm speaking here on behalf of your parents and of your employer and really must request a clear and immediate explanation. I'm astonished. Quite astonished. I thought I knew you as a calm and sensible person, and now you suddenly seem to be showing off with a peculiar whims. This morning, your employer did suggest a possible reason for your failure to appear. It's true. It had to do with the money that was recently entrusted to you. But I came near to giving him my word of honor that that could not be the right explanation. But now that I see your incomprehensible stubbornness, I no longer feel any wish whatsoever to intricate on your behalf. And nor is your position all that secure. I had originally intended to say all this to you in private, but since you caused me to waste my time here for no good reason, I don't see why your parents should not also learn of it. Your turnover has been very unsatisfactory of late. I grant you that it's not the time of year to do specially good business. We recognize that. But there simply is no time of year to do no business at all, Mr. Samsa. We cannot allow there to be. But sir, called Gregor behind himself and forgetting all else in the excitement. I'll open up immediately. Just a moment. I'm slightly unwell, an attack of dizziness. I haven't been able to get up. I'm still in a bed now. I'm quite fresh again now, though I'm just getting out of the bed. Just a moment, be patient. It's not quite as easy as I thought. I'm quite right now, though it's shocking what can suddenly happen to a person. I was quite all right last night. My parents know about it. Perhaps better than me. I had a small symptom of it last night already. They must have noticed it. I don't know why I didn't let you know at work, but you always say that you can get over illness without staying at home. Please don't make my parents suffer. There's no basis for any of the accusations that you're making. Nobody's ever said a word to me about any of these things. Maybe you haven't read the latest contracts I sent in. I'll set off with the 8 o'clock train as well. These few hours of rest have given me enough strength. You don't need to wait, sir. I'll be in the office soon after you. And please be so good as to tell that to the boss and recommend me to him. And while Gregor gushed out these words, hardly knowing what he was saying, he made his way over to the chest of drawers. This was easily done, probably because of the practice he had already had in bed, where he now tried to get himself upright. He really did want to open the door, really did want to let them see him and speak to him with the chief clerk. The others were being so insistent, and he was curious to learn what they would say when they caught the sight of him. If they were shocked, then it would no longer be Gregor's responsibility and he could rest. If, however, they took everything calmly, he would still have no reason to be upset. And if he hurried, he really could be at the station for 8 o'clock. The first few times he tried to climb up on the smooth chest of drawers, he just slid down again. But he finally gave himself one last swing and stood there upright. The lower part of his body was in serious pain, but he no longer gave any attention to it. Now he let himself fall against the back of a nearby chair and held tightly to the edges of it with his little legs. By now he had also calmed down and kept quiet so that he could listen to what the chief clerk was saying. "Did you understand a word of all that?" the chief clerk asked his parents. "Surely he is not trying to make fool of us." "Oh God," called his mother. who was already in tears. He could be seriously ill and we are making him suffer. Greed? Greed? She then cried. Mother, his sister called from the other side. They communicated across Grogger's room. You'll have to go for the doctor straight away. Grogger is ill. Quick, get the doctor. Did you hear the way Grogger spoke just now? That was the voice of an animal, said the chief clerk with a calmness that was in contrast with his mother's scream. Anna, Anna, his father called into the kitchen through the entrance hall. Clapping his hands, get a locksmith here now. And the two girls, their skirts swishing, immediately ran out through the hall, wrenching open the front door of the flat as they went. How had his sister managed to get dressed so quickly? There was no sound of the door banging shut again. They must have left it open. People often do in homes where something awful has happened. Grogger, in contrast, had become much calmer, so they couldn't understand his words anymore, although they seemed clear enough to him. Now, the family has realized that there was something wrong with the Grogger and they were ready to help him. The first response to a situation had been confident and wise, and that made him feel better. He felt that he had been drawn back in among people, and from the doctor and the locksmith he expected great and surprising achievements. Whatever was said next would be crucial, so in order to make his voice as clear as possible, he coughed a little, but taking care to do this not too loudly, as even this might well sound different from the way that a human coughs. And he was no longer sure he could judge this for himself. Meanwhile, it had become very quiet in the next room. Perhaps his parents were sat at the table whispering with the clerk, or perhaps they were all pressed against the door and listening. Grogger slowly pushed his way over to the door with the chair. Once there, he let go of it and threw himself onto the door, holding himself upright against it using the adhesive on the tips of his legs. He rested there a little while to recover from the effort involved and then set himself to the task of turning the key in the lock with his mouth. He seemed unfortunately to have no proper teeth. How was he, then, to grasp the key? But the lack of teeth was, of course, made up for with a very strong jaw. Using the jaw, he really was able to start the key turning, ignoring the fact that he must have been causing some kind of damage, as a brown fluid came from his mouth, flowed over the key, and dripped onto the floor. Listen, said the chief clerk into the next door. Is turning the key. Grogger was greatly encouraged by this, but they all should have been calling to him, his father and his mother too. Well done, Grogger, they should have cried. Keep at it, keep hold of the lock. And with the idea that they were all excitedly following his efforts, he bit on the key with all his strength, paying no attention to the pain he was causing to himself. As the key turned around, he turned round the lock with it, only holding himself upright with his mouth, and hung onto the key or pushed it down again with the whole weight of his body as needed. The clear sound of the lock as it snapped back was Grogger's sign that he could break his concentration, and as he regained his breath, he said to himself, "So I didn't need the locksmith after all." Then he lay his head on the handle of the door to open it completely. Because he had to open the door in this way, he was already wide open before he could be seen. He had first to slowly turn himself around one of the double doors, and he had to do it very carefully if he did not want to fall flat on the back before entering the room. He was still occupied with his difficult movement, unable to pay attention to anything else, when he heard the chief clerk exclaim aloud, "Oh!" which sounded like the soughing of the wind. Now he also saw him. He was the nearest to the door, his hand pressed against his open mouth and slowly retreating as if driven by a steady and invisible force. Grogger's mother, her hair still disheveled from bed despite the chief clerk's being there, looked at his father. Then she unfolded her arms, took 2 steps forward towards Grogger, and snagged down into the flow into her skirts that spread themselves out around her, and her head disappeared down onto her breast. His father looked hostile and clenched his fist as if wanting to knock Grogger back onto his room. Then he looked uncertainly round the living room, covered his eyes with his hands, and wept so that his powerful chest shook. So, till now, we have seen how Grogger's parents were so shocked by looking at him, how they don't wanted to accept him. They were really totally thrilled by what they saw because he was metamorphosized. He was changed completely into a horrible vermin, into an insect. So, the next part will be continued soon. Stay tuned.